Hi, intro class. I thought I would talk about some of Gabriel Orozco and Ben Lewis and your responses, my responses to your responses, with a pretty funny Snapchat plugin that allows me to be the Mona Lisa. It's pretty goofy. I'll turn it off here in a second, but I thought you guys could use a little bit of humor, especially since we're talking about something that's a bit absurd on its face, an empty shoebox. So let me turn that off. There we go. So, Gabriel Orozco's empty shoebox. Some of you guys did watch some of the other videos and do, some research into more of Orozco's work. I think he does a pretty fine job in general of talking about what he thinks the meaning of empty shoebox is, and I think Ben Lewis does a albeit a bit cynical job of pushing back against the institutions and making us aware of the fact that narratives are generated and pushed by qualified and professional historians and curators and directors of museums and galleries. These are people who don't just arrive where they are necessarily, but have a lot of influence on what is seen, where it's seen, how it's interpreted, and so on. And just as a kind of anecdote, for many years after grad school, I did something called art handling. I worked for a company. I'm from Denver. And so I moved back to Denver to start a job at a art handling company where I was a project manager. And in general, art handling is twofold. It's the kind of what it sounds like, the straight up shipment and installation of artworks in public and private, mostly private institutions, but sometimes public. So that's museums, galleries, and wealthy patrons' homes. The other half of it is the storage of artworks in large warehouses and vaults. Actually most artwork goes. That's where most artwork goes that is bought and sold. It ends up being put into a temperature controlled situation that protects it from keeping it in an archival situation or from being stolen. Museums and galleries also have collections, but they're often rotating and dealing with art handling companies that are also storing, or they have their own in-house kind of preparators and art handlers. Now, the anecdote I was gonna relay is that when I was working at this company in Denver, we were very tethered to a art collector. It was actually a married couple. They were called the Logan family. That's the last name, the Logans. Don't remember off the top of my head their first names at the moment. It's been a while, but they were West Coast art collectors, very wealthy, and they had been making a push toward living and creating a museum up in the mountains in Colorado, in Vail and some very wealthy areas, and this is where their second home, third home, whatever is, and they needed a company that could house and transport artworks to and from the mountains, which developed into a relationship with some local galleries. And then ultimately the Denver Art Museum had a huge revamp and built a new building. And so this new building became an opportunity for them to not only donate to a wing of that museum, but to also have artworks of theirs presented and displayed. And so when the museum opened, they had a pretty extensive and large, I would say the couple was in the top 10 biggest collectors in North America at the time, and they wanted to exhibit their works, but there's a ulterior motive to exhibiting their works, because they're also looking to promote the work in hopes of it becoming more valuable. And so what ended up happening while I was there that was really fascinating was that there's this huge influx of interest around contemporary Chinese artworks, paintings and sculptures especially. And I was working at this art handling company, and I just saw this massive amount of artwork coming in, and we were asked to, crate it, ship it, receive it, store it, or sometimes even if they came in as canvases, we'd have to build stretchers and stretch the paintings, the canvases on the stretchers, so they could be exhibited or sold and displayed. And the work was being bought very cheaply, and then being funneled into a local gallery where it was then being sold. And at the same time, I was Kent and Vicky Logan. So Kent Logan was also someone who was actively a writer and was writing about contemporary Chinese art and kind of positioning some of the work that he was buying as significant or important to a discussion or discourse around contemporary art. And so he's trying to kind of inject Chinese contemporary art into a larger Western dialogue of Western art. And not that that's inappropriate necessarily on its face, but you can see where there's a possible conflict of interest of sorts. So when you're buying the thing that then you're promoting as meaningful and then selling it, right? And so the museum would have, for its first year, and I think it still continues, these big exhibits of contemporary Chinese art, but then you could go across the street to a selection of galleries and buy the work. And so there's this just kind of strange moment where I really got to witness there being a generating of a discourse around the commodities that were being brought and pushed and sold in a kind of public face and then a private face. And I got really fascinated in how the institution played a role, because they clearly wanted the support and finances of the Ken and Vicky Logan, and they wanted to exhibit their works because that brought in the public and brought in revenue and dot, 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 dot. But then they also, played a role in the promotion of the works that would ultimately get privately sold. And so, to the benefit of Ken and Vicky Logan. And so it just, in the kind of way that Ben Lewis is talking, it was like, oh, wow, these are, there's this wealthy elite of sort, people who have the financial means to create a market, and then gets validated or validated by academic texts and by the exhibitions in an art museum, which helps see the sale and the promoting of it in private galleries as credible, right? And so I find that all totally fascinating, and something that I think Ben Lewis is pointing to in a real critical way, where he's saying, well, who are the gatekeepers, much like Berger is talking about, who is involved in creating a dialogue or discourse around generating the meaning of a work, and whose work gets displayed and why. And we'll talk a little bit more. I'll start to bring up some more examples of this, because when you start to dig into it, you can find that there are a handful of very exclusive and wealthy collectors who can define the culture around art for a public in general, because they have so much influence on who gets to be exhibited and why. And so our definitions of what is happening at any given time in the art world has a lot to do with our understanding of who is benefiting and who potentially is profiting. So that all said, though, a less cynical take is that there still is meaning in what Gabriel Orozco is doing here. And although you may have an opinion on whether or not you think it's good or not, like Ben Lewis clearly doesn't, like many of you pointed out, it doesn't make it meaningless. And if you look at the whole of Orozco's work, and if you care to follow his work, you could see and understand why maybe this work makes sense, why it might be part of a larger whole in terms of what he's trying to communicate. And so if you start to dig into his artwork, you might, the thing to be careful about, by the way, when looking up artists, you just really have to make sure that you're seeing what is actually theirs. Like, I know for a fact that this work is not Gabriel Orozco's, it's misrepresented by Pinterest. I would steer clear myself of Pinterest because I think it's often mislabeled. Another one that's incorrect down here that often gets touted, or in its initial search for artworks by this artist, sometimes gets mistakenly placed as his. I know this isn't his. But when we think about what makes something credible, often we're trying to break down, I think, some of the ideas that are kind of fetish around artworks needing to look or the artworks needing to look hard to have made, or difficult, or the craft is complex of some sort. And you can clearly see that some of what he does is very simple, and the craft is not really very present necessarily, or at the forefront of what we're attending to. Whereas, the car and the craft involved in splitting that car down the middle and putting it back together, that's extremely difficult and meaningful and in its own way if you care about that. Now, I'm not sure that would be something to interrogate within yourself if you think something needs to seem difficult to have made in order to be meaningful. Now, we've talked about Duchamp, and we've talked about the idea of it being possibly meaningful to imagine someone arriving at a difficult thought in order to constitute something being, credible or valid in some sense. Or worthy of our time, I guess, is another way of talking about these things. But these really, I think these beautiful. This is one of my kind of favorite works of his, where he's really thinking about typologies and organizing principles. This is these are exploded tires along a highway stretch, where he's organizing them based on a set of criteria. Maybe the way that the tire breaks, and so on. And so he's really giving us a sense of how humans tend to want to create typologies and typographies, right? He does this again along a beachfront where he's collecting all the trash. And when you start to look into his work, if you watched the video, and I don't have it present, the R21, really talks about how he is invested in elevating artworks, or elevating things that are seen at first as meaningless or not art, and positioning them in a way, for instance, like the grocery store, organizing things based on maybe a principle of formal properties, for instance. I think this is really a nice one. So he's thinking about, how the labels of products in a grocery store might exhibit formal properties that are similar to one another. And here, let me see if I can find a bigger version of that. Right, so the formal qualities of color, connecting the watermelons and the cat food cans, right, and the multiplicity of them, right, so the multiples of the same thing, and we're going to get into, after our kind of midway point, talking about people like, let me see if I got that there, Warhol. Right, and Warhol's going to be creating boxes that resemble products, and he's going to have a lot to say about this type of mass production. And so when you look at the ready-made and you leap to someone like Warhol, you can leap to someone like Gabriel Orozco and think about how he is thinking about the preciousness or the repurposing of something that is at once a box for shoes that's sold on a shelf that then becomes a container for something else, and that process by which something shifts or changes, and then thinking about that in relationship to these kind of larger art spaces that become containers for objects, is really interesting. And if you care or invested in some of the discourse around sculpture or installation or institutions of art. Now, that all said, I think Ben Lewis has got a point, though, in saying, well, why does everything get decontextualized to the point where he says we could theorize about the someone farting in a gallery, right? Which we could. I think he's got a point to be made in the sense that we need to be vigilant and critical, because, like our Derek Matravers and the philosophers were saying, who's holding artists in the art world to account for things being not just meaningful, but being worth our attention, right? In the world of competing issues and thoughts and ideas, is art doing a good enough job of making things meaningful for us, and helping us make sense of the world? I think if that's something we should value, then we need to be open to the idea that Orozco might be saying, well, I think the poetics of something like an empty shoebox is worthy, whereas Ben Lewis would say, this is garbage. This isn't something pushing anything. This isn't telling me anything that's profound and meaningful in general to our lives. But, you know, that's his interpretation. But he's also being a bit of a provocateur in that setting, because he is talking in a venue where the dominant voices are, in general, major players, Eastern European culture and the United States, who are often white males, and that's complicated. That's really complicated in a host of obvious ways, I think. But I think he, how do I put this? I think it's really important to note that I think there is overlap, and I think Orozco in some weird ways is also being critical of those same institutions. And I think maybe Ben Lewis is not acknowledging that as much. I think he's quick to dismiss, at least in that conversation, in that short conversation, how Orozco might be, a Mexican-born national who is making artwork that is pushing up against some of the expectations of a commerce-based art market and art world. So he's making something that isn't very saleable, right? Or is questionably making these institutions look as though they're trying and attempting to sell us trash. Okay? And that being somewhat wrapped up in this kind of imperialistic problem that we have, where we are in a broader sense, outside of just the art market, being sold things as if brands mean everything, or who is influencing their importance is meaningful. Okay, so as opposed to just what it's saying or its actual function. Now, I think, as always, so far you guys all pretty much hit it. I got a lot of what I just said from your responses, your feedback to the questions I was answering, and the thing that I would hope that you would really pull from this, and I think it's important to think about going back a second if you didn't, and watch that Art 21 video on Orozco, because it's really nice to hear the artists talk themselves. And I think the MoMA page that talked about where he talked specifically about this artwork is really great, but the larger context of someone talking about not having a traditional studio space, right? Not thinking in terms of there being a space of production that you go to, but that the world is full of things and objects and moments that they could use as an artistic space, is something to be thoughtful and considered about with his work. I'm sorry that was a long, kind of much longer ramble than I thought it would be, but I hope it was illuminating on some level. And as always, I look forward to seeing more of your work. We're moving toward our quiz 1, so I'm gonna start getting you guys prepped for that as well. Okay.